meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining us this evening on this last webinar of the series, Recognizing and Interpreting Historical Materials. The webinar this evening discusses metal cans. Recognizing that cans comprise a sizable proportion of artifact assemblages on late historical period sites, a presentation and discussion on the wide variety of cans we encounter would take hours in a normal setting. Unfortunately, we are pressed for time this evening, so I humbly ask for your indulgence as I race through this discussion tonight. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing along with all the other webinars we have done this year. I ask that you visit the Arizona Preservation Foundation's website for web links to these webinars. I'd also like to take the time to thank the Arizona Preservation Foundation for hosting the series on their website and for helping to market this series. So let's go ahead and get started. Canned food has been an important part of the American lifestyle for more than 150 years. The can was first engineered in France in 1810 by Nicolas Appert, who was awarded a handsome sum by Napoleon Bonaparte. Ironically, however, it was England that would take advantage of Appert's method of canning food and turn this idea into an industry. English pioneers Peter Durand and Brian Donkin began improving Appert's methods of packaging by using tinplate cans. Someday this will start working. Initially packaging meat for the English Navy, these early cans weighed as much as 7 pounds when filled with veal. The second half of the 19th century would witness the can's entrance into domestic life, both in Europe and in America. This wondrous invention and revolutionary method of food packaging wasn't without its perils. In 1852, canned food inspected on behalf of the English Navy was found to contain a high ratio of spoiled meat. As reported by the press at the time, they fished out pieces of heart, rotting tongues from a dog or sheep, offal, blood, a whole kidney, perfectly putrid, ligaments and tendons, and a mass of pulp. Some organs appeared to be from diseased animals. Canned meat inspected at naval yards across the country was found to be garbage and putridity in a horrible state. An estimated 600,000 pounds of canned meat were discarded as a result of the scandal. But it was at this time that condensed and evaporated milk emerged on the market in England and in America, saving the canning industry from a nasty downfall. Cans were here to stay, and in subsequent decades, a plethora of products emerged on the market, ranging from canned fruits and vegetables to meat and fish, as well as tobacco, coffee, and tea. In the 20th century, non-food items were also canned, including oil and gas, grease, paint, and other industrial products. Technological advancements and developments in the mid to late 19th century, coupled with demand for canned foods and other goods, dramatically increased the production of cans. Annual production in 1914 was estimated at 3 billion cans. Arthur Judge, editor of the Canning Trade magazine, observed in 1914, "If there be one thing which human life and all endeavor depends more than all else, it must be the food supply. Therefore, that method which improves and increases this supply, garnering the surplus in days of plenty, to release it in the bleak days of want, unchanged and as nutritious as ever, which makes the best foods cheap to the poor in the slums as well as to the rich in their mansions, which robs scurvy of its dread on the high seas, in the burning desert, or in the frozen polar regions, that method must be the greatest blessing conferred upon humanity. Such is the canned food industry." Currently, more than 200 billion steel cans are produced each year around the world. It's estimated that the average household in the United States uses about 600 steel cans a year. In addition to steel cans, an estimated 200 million aluminum cans are produced each year, primarily for beverage containers, although a sizable number of food cans are also made with aluminum. The following discussion will provide a brief commentary of cans manufactured and distributed across the U.S. from the latter half of the 19th century through the 1960s. Tinplate cans. Within a decade of the can's first appearance in France and England, the industry had traversed the Atlantic to Boston and New York. The success of packaging goods with cans, heretofore the domain of glass bottles, ceramic containers, and other materials, was due in part to their durability and their ease in handling and storing. As noted just a few seconds ago, this was certainly not always the case in the early decades of canning, as England's Navy found out the hard and disgusting way. Nonetheless, food packaged in cans could be preserved much longer than other containers. The use of tinplate as a coating was imperative to the success of canning, considering tinplate did not corrode as easily as other metals and was not affected by the natural acids in stored food. Initially, can making was done at the packing plants, considering there wasn't yet a demand for mass production. The various packing companies therefore made cans as they needed them due to the expense of making them. Can making was a labor-intensive process with a cadre of workers specializing in various steps of the process. Hand tools were used to cut the metal, including the body and the caps, and workers assembled the cans by hand. It would take several decades for new technologies to be developed, expanding production exponentially at the expense of human labor. By the end of the 19th century, can making and food packaging were no longer co-industries. Food cans comprise several components. The main body of the can, a sheet of metal, is rolled and its end seams are fastened together. In the 19th century, this was done by simply lapping the two ends and soldering the seam. The can was finished with top and bottom caps, which were also initially soldered onto the can. The top end was made with a hole in the center where food was thrust into the can, after which the cap was soldered and the entire can and contents processed by immersing in boiling water. By the mid-19th century, packers and canners had learned that by adding a small pinhole or a vent hole on the top cap, excess heat and pressure produced within the can during the processing could be released while soldering the caps on. When sufficient time had cleared for releasing this pressure, the pinhole was also soldered. The hole and cap can, as this came to be called, was perhaps the most common can produced in the late 19th century. This can was also known by archaeologists and collectors as the hole and top and later packer cans. As shown in this slide, caps varied in size depending on what products were thrust into the can. Food products like tomatoes would exhibit large caps, while other vegetables would be slightly smaller. Condensed and evaporated milk cans were even smaller. Food cans also varied in size depending on the contents. Indeed, the sizes shown here remained largely constant or consistent well into the 20th century, by which time sanitary cans had replaced hole and cap cans. Consequently, archaeologists generally don't measure the dimensions of food cans when recording sites on Class 3 surveys, because these sizes did not change when recording or appreciably through the modern era. Can sizes do not offer any indication of a temporal occupation or use of that site. Rather, it's important to record the relative proportion of food cans and milk cans and other can types on an archaeological site for interpretive purposes regarding the site's function and use. We would, however, measure food cans collected from data recovery projects, as the level of analysis is much greater for these projects, and important research questions might be answered with this level of analysis. This doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't observe the varying sizes of food cans on survey. For instance, a can with a high number of large-sized or number 10 cans might indicate that the site was a temporary camp related to mining or logging or some other activity. Temporary camps, as you can imagine, would have ensured that there were large stores of bulk food for feeding the workers. For such an important development as the tin can certainly was, it's worth noting that until 1858, there were no can openers. Cans were opened by any means available. E.J. Warner invented the first can opener just in time for the American Civil War, where food and milk cans were actually produced in very large numbers. Over time, other can openers were invented and put on the market. In Arizona, however, given the remoteness of mines and camps, homesteads, and settlements, cans were still opened by whatever means necessary. Many documented sites will exhibit cans with varying types of can openings. The tapered meat can was developed in the mid-1870s, which comprised a rectangular top and a bottom, as well as a key wine strip on the side to easily open the can and dump out all of that yummy goodness. Key wine strips were common on other cans after this time, including fish and sardine cans and eventually coffee cans. The American Civil War influenced the mass production of food and milk cans, which in turn led to greater technological developments. Whereas cans were once produced largely by hand by specialist workers like cappers and tippers, new machinery replaced laborers when it came to rolling the cans or capping the ends, soldering all of the seams, as well as preparing stronger side seams like the locked seam. This slide compares early hole and cap cans, which are on the left and were hand soldered with either lap or plumb joints, with a machine soldered can, which used the lock side seam. You can see how much smoother and cleaner that machine seam is. These improved cans with the lock seam were more apt to keep the canned goods fresher for much longer period. The lock seam was dominant for only a short time into the 20th century before it was replaced by the Max Ams double seam. Don't worry, we'll see that word on here soon. This new seam was essentially a rolled seam of several layers. Initially developed in Europe, double seamed cans were not suitable for food cans, but engineers affiliated with the Max Ams company in America developed a suitable liquid rubber compound in the 1890s that sealed the seam, thereby requiring only a very thin layer of solder on the exterior that was not readily visible like traditional solder seams. This image shows the general temporal trends or ranges for the types of hole and cap cans that we're likely to find on archaeological sites. The hand soldered seams on the left, which you can see are very crude and almost sloppy looking. The machine soldered cans in the middle, and the double seamed hole and cap cans on the right. Mind you, the top cap on all of these cans still exhibited the hole and cap. Milk cans were very common during and after the American Civil War, whether evaporated or condensed. Both types of canned milk are made by heating milk to kill off the harmful bacteria, resulting in a water-depleted product, but ensuring a much longer shelf life for the milk. The primary difference is that condensed milk includes sugar, which is added in the heating process and is thicker, as I've been told. Gail Borden was the first to introduce canned milk in America with his Eagle brand, but other companies followed suit. Excuse me. The development of the can prior to 1915 was much the same as hole and cap food cans, soldered seams and ends with a small cap in the top. Likewise, the pinhole was soldered last after processing the milk in the can, as you can see in the lower left picture. Given the nutritional value of milk, it's not surprising to find a high density of these cans on archaeological sites. In many cases, cans were simply opened with slits for easy drinking. Whereas food cans don't have to be measured in Class 3 surveys, we do make a practice of measuring milk cans because their sizes may be temporally diagnostic. As shown here, Donald Simonis, archaeologist with the BLM, developed this guide for dating milk cans in 1997. Please note that these measurements are standard and not metric. Now, there are lingering questions as to how accurate this table is and how Simonis received this information. Nonetheless, until we can confirm the accuracy of these dates and measurements, we continue to use this table for documenting milk cans. In my experience, at least, there's generally a pretty good correlation between the information on this sheet and the dates of the sites in general, especially when compared to other temporal items like glass bottles, especially glass bottles. Just an FYI, given the increasing density of documented historical sites, regardless of what region or locality we may live in, I strongly recommend buying a combination tape measure that's both metric and standard. As this table illustrates, milk cans were soldered, like food cans, both seams and caps, until about 1903, when the double seam, which is labeled on the table as crimped, you see here, was used on a wide scale. By 1915, the soldered ends and the hole and cap itself were no longer in use. They were replaced with what we call as the matchstick filler can. But that's a discussion we'll talk about in a short bit. Other can types observed on sites across Arizona include pancake syrup cans, which were either rectangular or appropriately shaped like log cabins. These cans used spouts rather than can ends. Soldered seams and spouts may be seen on these cans, indicating the manufacturer was prior, or the manufacture of these cans was prior to about 1910. Sprinkler top cans were developed in the 1890s for a variety of powder products. One popular can that's observed on many sites here in Arizona is the KC baking powder cans. First made in 1891, they were very popular well into the 1940s. After about 1920, they started to emboss their lids with same as 25 years ago, same as 35 years ago, or even same as 48 years ago, making it fairly easy to date the can, at least to within a few years. By 1900, American and international industry were seemingly at their peak. As Greta Rail noted at last month's seminar, technological advances in machinery and production revolutionized the glass bottle industry, and the same was true of the canning industry. The closing years of the 19th century had already introduced fully automatic production of cans, as well as the Max-Ams double side seam, which inspired the manufacture of a wide variety of cans for other goods. It was only a matter of time when soldered caps on food cans would be rendered obsolete. Indeed, the open top can, or the popular name sanitary can, had been developed in 1897, but it would take several more years, that is until 1904, for an automated machine to be developed that would enable cost-effective and efficient production of these cans. Within 2 decades after 1904, this new can had effectively replaced the traditional hole and cap can. These images were copied from a 1912 publication of the Canning Trade magazine and illustrates the temporary coexistence of these two food cans, the traditional Packers on the left and the new open top sanitary can on the right. Packer cans at this time were undoubtedly made with the double side seams, as were the open top cans. Other changes to the industry in the first half of the 20th century included changes in how milk cans were manufactured, as well as the introduction of tobacco tins, vacuum-packed coffee tins, and new varieties of meat cans. Henry Ford revolutionized the automobile industry with his assembly line, and with his success, influenced the growth of a number of independent industries, including the oil industry. In 1933, consumer demand for an easy-to-use oil product resulted in the introduction of the 1-quart oil can. Finally, by 1935, the canning industry had developed a compatible beverage can to replace, in part at least, the use of glass bottles for beer and soda. The sanitary or open top can is very common on 20th century sites. Granted, as I've just mentioned, sites in the early 1900s might exhibit a combination of sanitary and packer or holding cap cans. But as a general rule, sites that post-date 1920, or the early 1920s at least, will usually include or comprise only sanitary cans. The sanitary can incorporated the double side seam that was previously developed by the Max Ends Can Company. The two cap ends, rather than being stamped and soldered, were actually crimped onto the two ends without the use of solder. As I noted before, while successfully developed in 1897, it took several more years for a machine to develop in order to produce these cans in sufficient numbers to make it profitable. Initially marketed and sold by the Sanitary Can Company in 1904, it would become the can of choice for many types of food, especially for large fruits that had previously been shoved through the holes of packer cans. Prior to this time, fruits were often bruised and otherwise damaged when being shoved into these packer cans. As the open top or sanitary can became the primary can of choice, a new generation of can openers were introduced to the consumer. The Sanitary Can Company was acquired by the American Can Company in 1908. This large conglomerate was formed by more than 50 separate canning companies and would dominate the industry through the 20th century, along with its competitor, the Continental Can Company, which was incorporated around 1913. The influence of the double seam and the open top can on the can making and packaging industries is illustrated in this graph. You can see the incredible growth of the can production between 1900 and 1920. Also notice that the production rates on this table are now measured per hour rather than per day as they once had been prior to 1900. As we discussed earlier, evaporated and condensed milk were traditionally packaged using similar methods to the hole and cap food cans. The difference, of course, was that the cap was much smaller. Double seaming of the can sides was introduced as early as 1903, as shown on the chart here. By about 1915, the soldered cap was no longer used. Rather, only the vent hole remained to be soldered. This new cap design, shown here on the slides, is known as the matchstick filler can. No soldered caps are on the can. So when I record sites, I use only the term matchstick filler can to reference milk cans that were made after 1915. For cans that are produced prior to 1915, I use the term hole and cap milk cans. The Simonist chart also indicates that crimped end seams were also added to cans after 1903. The end seams he's referring to are the top and bottom caps that are similarly seen on sanitary cans. In my experience, however, I've only seen stamped lids on milk cans, whether they be the early hole and cap types or the later matchstick filler cans. Granted, the use of solder isn't noticeable or not always noticeable on the caps of matchstick filler cans. Maybe these companies were using a special rubber sealer for stamping these milk cans. If you look at the picture on the right here of the matchstick filler can, you'll notice that the opening is made with a church key opener, the triangle opening as you see on the can here. You can tell that this can was made after 1935. This church key opening, or the church key itself, was designed for flat top beverage cans in 1935. And we'll discuss these shortly. But I just wanted to just show you this to illustrate the need to look at all attributes of an artifact that you're recording in the field, not just the fact that it's a matchstick filler can, but also look at the way it was opened. That might also help you to date the can. With the development of the double seam and other technology, there was a plethora of new can types introduced in the first decade of the new century. Pocket tobacco tins are very common on archaeological sites with hinged lids and usually a striking platform on the bottom for lighting matches. Sometimes one can make out the tobacco brand on the can. Oftentimes not. The sprinkler top can remained popular through the 20th century for baking powder and cleansers. These types of cans shown here, all of these types of cans shown here, are generally made after 1900. Paint cans, as well as peanut butter, lard, and even coffee, were packaged in what I call lug handle cans. They're named, of course, after the lug, which is right here on the side of the can, which allowed for wire handles to be attached for easy handling and carrying. Of course, it's impossible to determine what was in these cans, because most of the cans that we do record on these sites are heavily rusted and corroded. Meat cans were processed early on in the traditional tapered rectangular cans, but through the 20th century, additional can types and shapes were also used, including sardine cans, oyster tins, with the traditional key strips, and more rounded cans. All of these cans were made with a double C again. Initially, coffee beans or coffee cans, as shown on the left, were packed and sealed with external friction lids. That is, the lid closes on the outside of the can. Although technically vacuum packed, these cans were not terribly successful, as they did not create an airtight seal to prevent the fresh coffee from spoiling before it reached the kitchen table. As a result, most people would buy small amounts of coffee beans at the store and have it ground while at the store. From 1919 to 1922, the American Can Company developed a can on the right with a key wind strip closure that kept the coffee can airtight and fresh from the producer to the kitchen table. From the early 1920s into the 1960s, these cans were very big business, influencing the growth of the percolated coffee, and they're very common on sites and can be found either whole or in fragments. As a result, they can easily be misinterpreted as representing food cans or even meat cans. In terms of overall shape, these cans range anywhere from 4 to 6 inches in diameter and were rather short in height. You'll rarely find an entire can in one piece. Rather, you'll find the tops of the cans or the bottoms of the cans. You'll find the body itself, the inner rings, which is right here, the inner rings. Keep an eye out when you're recording these types of cans for embossed lids. The one on the left reads regular grind, so you can tell right off the bat that this is a coffee can. Also keep an eye out for the little scars at the bottom of some of the cans. That's where the church key was attached, so that when you bought the can, you just rip that off and open the can itself. As I said, these cans were phased out by the late 1960s when coffee was packaged in larger cans that did require a can opener and used the resealable plastic lids. These cans are still made today, the metal cans with the plastic lids, alongside all plastic cans. As I mentioned before, in the automobile age, the public demanded convenience for regular maintenance, including access to oil. In 1933, the old-fashioned oil can was put on the market. People just needed the spout to thrust into the can and they can fill their engines. Many oil cans will be embossed with the oil type and the company on the lids. And sometimes you can even read it on a very rusted can in the field. Sometimes you can even see the lithograph paint that's on the bodies of the can. You can even read what the company was as well. So it's very much worth recording this information when you document a site. There were a large number of oil companies in the first half of the 20th century, but by about 1950, many had been acquired or merged to create the larger corporate entities that we all know and love today. Over the last 20 years, I've collected my own oil book, as it were, which includes brief company histories and common brand names, and even, where possible, pictures and images of what these cans look like. In this way, when I document a bunch of cans in the field, oil cans, I can always return to the office and look them up in this book and get a general range for when these cans were made, so that we can get an idea of when they were actually deposited into these trash scatters. Metal oil cans date from about 1933 to the mid-1960s, by which time they were phased out. Through the first several decades of the 20th century, the American Can Company worked diligently to create a beverage can to cut into the beverage market that was long dominated by the glass bottle makers. But there were two obstacles to overcome. Obstacle number one, they needed a strong side seam that could withstand the pressure that was generated from inside the can as a result of the carbonated beverages. Obstacle number two, they needed a suitable interior coating or lining that would prevent the contact of the beer or soda with the tin plate on the can. Skanky beer, as we all know, has always been abhorred by beer drinkers and hellraisers. Finally, in 1934 and 35, the metal beverage can entered the market with a 1-inch wide soldered seam. You can see that here, but only on the exterior, with a suitable interior coating to keep the beverage pure and glorious. Within a short time, both beer and soda were marketed and sold in cans. Flat top cans, like the one shown here, had to be opened with the church key, the one I just discussed earlier with the matchstick filler can. This was the era of the church key opening. Not only were they used on beverage cans, as I intimated, but also on every other manner of can you can think of. You'll recall that the matchstick filler, I already told you about that, so don't forget what I'm saying. So please remember that any can that you find, or any can that you document, regardless of whether it's a flat top beverage or a food can or a milk can, any can that has this church key opening is going to date after 1935. The slide on the right illustrates the three different types of seams that you might observe when recording a site. These names that I've given here are my own names, so that I can easily record them in the field. I'm not sure that there's any official name. I call them out as straight seams, notched seams, and tooth seams. According to Jack Martels, the author of the Beer Can Collector's Bible, flat top cans made prior to the late 1950s had only the straight seam here. After the late 1950s, they were made with the notch seam or the tooth seam to make the cans even stronger. I might add that in the course of preparing this webinar, I've noticed that many coffee cans and even oil cans in this period were also made with the 1-inch soldered seams. I have to wonder if it was cheaper for the company to run all manner of cans, no matter what they were, or no matter what product was in it, through the seaming machines without going to the expense of switching over to other traditional seams. This was also the era of the cone top cans, which resembled bottles and even had crown caps on them. Collectors have identified several different types of cone tops based on their anatomy, like the low profile can, the J spout, the high profile, and the crown tainer. Side seams on cone tops were no different than their flat top cousins. They were either straight, notched, or toothed. Cone tops were also made in a variety of sizes, as shown here. Notice the tooth seams on both of these cans, which indicates they were made after the late 1950s. For obvious reasons, all beverage cans, whether they were flat top or cone top, were produced in very limited numbers during World War II. After 1947, however, the dam burst so to speak, and both flat tops and cone tops became very popular among the general public. The cone top beverage can did not survive the 60s, however, considering that the flat top was easier to store and probably more efficient to make or produce. Cone top cans still survived, however, into the modern era for automotive fluids like Freon or antifreeze. That is, when we were able to buy Freon from Checker Auto or AutoZone to put in our own cars. The Beatles' revolution was concurrent with major technological advancements and improvements in the canning industry. By the end of the 1960s, cone tops were gone. Oil cans were now made of composite or plastic materials with the metal cap ends. Pocket tobacco tins were no longer in use. They were phased out in favor of the cellophane wraps or the paper packs and other packages. As for the sanitary can, manufacturers since World War II had increasingly used less tin in the can's production. This necessitated changes in the can's design, as tin also contributed to the tensile strength of that can. In other words, a traditional sanitary can didn't have much tin in it. The can would collapse if you tried to store cans on top of one another. They would literally collapse because there wasn't enough strength in them. So in order to make up for that loss of strength from using less tin, manufacturers added beads to the body here. Around the same time, some manufacturers also came up and developed with the tin-free can, which is actually shown here, the tin-free can. There was absolutely no tin in this. The majority of the can was made from chromium. A thin solder was used on the exterior. While the thin solder was used on the exterior of traditional cans, it couldn't be used on these chromium cans because the solder wouldn't actually stick. So they had to come up with a new way of sealing the seams of the side seams of these cans using a welding technology. As such, seams on these tin-free cans are going to be much smoother, and you won't even be able to notice them on the cans. Sites from the late 60s and 70s will likely have both types of cans, either the light tin cans that still have the beads here, or the tin-free cans. It's going to be very hard to notice what these cans are made from when you're recording them in the sites, because in either case, they're all rusted and terribly corroded. But if you can observe the beads on the cans, that's what's most important. That's when you know that these cans were developed after the mid-1960s. It's also important to note that matchstick filler cans, or milk cans, continued to be manufactured in the traditional manner with the tin cans. So those kinds of cans were produced as late as 1985, while the food cans were developed in the type that you can see here. While the cone top was phased out quickly, it took time to phase out the flat top steel can. Aluminum was introduced in the early 1960s, first as the soft top of the steel can. This can is made from steel, but the tops and the bottoms are made with aluminum. That's why they were called the soft tops. But it was only a matter of time before all aluminum cans were eventually made, and with pull tabs. By 1965, soft tops and aluminum cans were on the market, especially on the East Coast, using the pull tabs. Through the 1970s, these cans became increasingly available across the entire country as the beverage companies converted to these new cans, the aluminum cans, I mean. For those of us who grew up in the 1970s, we remember having to recycle aluminum cans and steel cans separately. The development of the pull tabs was problematic from the get-go. As you can imagine, these were thrown casually on streets, in ponds and waterways, creating concerns over the impacts of this type of material waste on the natural environment. Over the course of just a couple of decades, companies developed multiple pull tab styles, summarized here. Jack Martell's provides a nice summary of the different types of pull tabs and openings for beer cans between 1960 and 1975. These early ones here are the soft tops, which were developed in the early 1960s. They even provided easy little instructions for where to open that can. In the 1960s and 70s, a much wider variety of pull tabs were developed. When it became clear that ripping off the pull tab and then throwing it away was not the right way to go for these cans, they started developing tabs that didn't necessarily come off the can. As a result, can collectors, especially beer and soda can collectors, have gone so far as to develop a typology for pull tabs. I honestly haven't studied this typology in great detail, as again, when we document these cans on Class 3 surveys, we don't usually go into this much detail. Over the next few years, however, we may not need to all become familiar with this typology, considering that we are only a few years short of 1975 as historical. Here is a slide that shows a nice little waste pile with very late historic period items, including our beaded cans, juice cans, beaded food cans, soft top cans with the pull tabs. I would imagine if you were to document these bottles, they would probably all date from the mid to late 1960s. Some of you may recognize this field cheat sheet for cans. This has been used in a number of field guides for the better part of 30 years and still comes in handy when recording cans in the field. Mind you, some of the dates that are on this can need to be updated and may not be accurate anymore. Nonetheless, it's still worth having and referencing when you're recording cans in the field. Remember that by and large, measuring matchstick filler cans should be carried out when you're recording those cans in the field. And it might be worth measuring cans that are of odd sizes, like very tall oil cans or tall rectangular cans that you're not quite sure what they may have contained. Maybe even small cans that are not easily recognizable. It's also important to record the opening of the cans to tell you what was inside, whether it was a food or a liquid or some kind of a non-edible product. While not quite as often, manufacturers and important information might be embossed on some of these cans or the can lids. It's not quite as common as, not even close to being as common as glass and bottles, but it's worth looking at when you record cans, just to do a quick look on the caps to see what kind of information there might be. Some field guides also include these tables, which has great information regarding the specific company and brand packaging histories. Again, it's worth noting that some of these dates may not be quite as valid anymore, but it's certainly something that we can all build on. As I've noted, we're only a few years from 1975 as the 50-year threshold for historical. By this time, federal legislation had banned the use of open dumps, and communities began constructing landfills for the disposal of trash. In a few more years, we'll find that the majority of all open dumps in Arizona will be technically historical in age. Consequently, and especially considering the ever-expanding 50-year threshold, it behooves us as professionals and site stewards to be familiar with modern methods of can manufacturing. Currently, cans are made by either steel that have very little tin or are entirely tin-free, or aluminum. All of those yummy products that we crave and have craved over the years. are still packaged, including pork brains with milk gravy, French toast puree, and of course, haggis. Cans are made either as two-piece cans, as shown in the upper right corner, or the traditional three-piece can, which has been the basic blueprint of the can for the better part of 200 years. Although the steel industry attempted to re-enter the beverage market in the early 1980s, the aluminum can is still king for sodas, beer, and juice. You can still buy the three-piece juice can, but that's increasingly rare because most people now buy their juices in plastic or composite containers. You've all heard the adage that history tends to repeat itself. Well, the dear old friend, the cone top can, that once resembled a bottle, has recently been refashioned for the modern age. No longer made from steel with soldered side seams, this new container is all aluminum and is made with either threaded caps or the crown caps. This concludes the webinar on cans, so I'd love to address any questions you might have. I would also like to point out that HAC, the Historical Archaeology Advisory Committee, of which I am a member of, we are going to try to come up with another series for the next year and possibly even to the year after, not necessarily with material culture, with artifacts. So please continue to look at the Arizona Preservation Foundation website for updates on what webinars might be available next year.
Tom, this is, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So a reminder, and I'm not sure if everyone can hear me, but I did put a reminder to please add any questions. You are just so good and so thorough.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
I'll go ahead and
It's like,
we got one comment. Tom did cover the history quite well. This was thorough. See, I didn't mean to suggest that, but apparently, thank you. Great presentation.
so I have a question, Tom.
Yes, ma'am.
I've got the mic. So we're moving into a time period when there's a lot of written records now for when these trash dumps were established on the landscape, and the maps will show them. Will there be as much need to do analysis in the field on these later things as we get, to the mid and late 70s? Where are we going? Archaeology, what we are used to is, more in the field rather than archival research. And I'm wondering if we're going to be doing more archival research in the future for some of these more recent sites.
I think that would be the appropriate way to go. I might add that we just finished an update, a revision, if you will, of the Down in the Dumps, which is a context statement for Arizona's waste treatment. And that also has a pretty detailed history, but I think other revisions will have to include even more details, and I think that would be an adequate way of mitigating these types of sites. The Arizona State Museum has also released a new policy regarding waste piles, isolated waste piles, and whether or not they would be classified or documented as an archaeological site or an isolate. There are certain circumstances, and we have that in place, as well as questions for people who may have questions about when is it a site, when is it not a site. So yes, I do believe that for anything after 1975, we better come up with an idea to find a way to put a lid on it, if you will.
Well, we look forward to seeing what you come up with for that. Thank you.
So Tom, there was a question that came in the Q&A. So it says, what can has stumped you in your discoveries?
What can? There have been some pretty small cans that look like matchstick filler cans, very tiny little guys that don't seem to fit Simonus's table. I think his smallest cans were about 2.5 inches in width and in height. But I've found smaller cans that don't seem to fit his category. So I'm not quite sure what was in those cans. Otherwise, quite a few cans. Cans that might have spouts, pieces of cans, especially rectangular cans that don't look like they're meat. So it's very difficult at times, especially on a class 3 survey when you're pressed for time and you got to hurry up and record that site. There's only so much that you can do as far as identifying these cans. I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
And then we have another question that's come in. Is there a database that covers numbers, types, dates, etc. of cans for Arizona and other wider south or the wider Southwest?
We do not have a database, but one thing I've been talking with the Historical Archaeology Advisory Committee is coming up with an updated field guide with updated dates that we could, release for the professionals and the public as well. That might help. But yeah, there is no database at the moment.
So Tom, I had a question. It just occurred to me. Majority of the cans that we find in our sites, Arizona, nationally, are made here in the US. What about cans having products that are not manufactured here in the US? Is there any guides around that? I'm thinking like we're near the border, stuff that may have been manufactured in Mexico or other products, because now we're worldwide, we're getting products in from across the world. So I assume are all cans standardized across the world, or is there any guides around products that are not US made?
I would imagine we could probably find guides in Australia. They seem to have a really good research on their material culture as well. I found quite a few guides in Australia on what to document and how to document. Maybe in Europe. I think a lot of our fish cans, like our sardines that you might find on sites, you're going to see Iceland on there or that kind of thing. So I think a lot of the fish was still being imported. It may have been canned in America, and they were required to put that on their cans as part of the law, federal law or international law, perhaps. But no, I don't know of too many other places. Australia is the only other one. The can typology, the pull tab typology, I think that's Holland. So I think there are some collectors in Europe that are coming up with their own research.
Something to consider, especially now that we've become more global. So another question. Let's see. Do you know of a guide for military cans used for rations?
I have collected as much as I can over the last 10 or 15 years. There's not too many guides per se. It's a matter of collecting these materials as far as inventories of what kind of cans they were making, the different kinds of rations, and then trying to piece it together with what you find. So the short answer is no, I haven't found it yet. I had the privilege, I guess you could say, a friend of mine, his brother was an avid collector in the 80s. He discovered the metal collector, and he joined this club that just went nuts. And they went out in the deserts of Western Arizona on BLM land, I might add, which is illegal and a federal crime. And they collected an absolutely amazing amount of garbage, of artifacts, of car parts, grenade parts, anything you can imagine, engine parts, tank parts, silverware, ration cans. And so I took as many photographs as I could when he showed me this property, because there's no way I could possibly collect it all. So I took as many photographs as I could. So one of these days, maybe I'll have the time to come up with some kind of a guide on the types of military cans, the ration cans.
Let's see, we have another question. Could your smaller cans be secrets or other medicine or breath mints? Growing up in the 50s and 60s, I had those to store my treasures. I remember those. Secrets.
I do remember those. Those were the
Yep.
flat ones, though, the ones that you opened up like a little pill box. The small cans I was talking about are round cans with the top and bottom, the traditional 3-piece can. So I couldn't imagine there would have been mints or aspirin or breath mints in there. So, but that's possible. If that gentleman or lady had those in their house, then maybe I'm completely wrong and I haven't found that one yet. So thank you very much.
And then one more question. Any information available for cans from Asia?
Not that I know of. I have to
Yeah.
be honest, I haven't reached out that far into Asia, so I have no idea. I've not done that kind of research. Unfortunately, most of my time, my full-time work is here in Arizona, so I have to concentrate whatever researches I can, but that's definitely something to look up, though.
Yeah. And
I'll
then
see
we
what I
have
can find.
another one, just a comment that says, I've seen salesman samples in very small cans. So
Oh.
that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a
Something to think about.
possibility. Yes, thank you.
Well, I believe we're right at 8 o'clock. And Mary Ellen posted again the webinar, and folks, please check out the Arizona Preservation webinar coming up. And it says, one last one says, has anyone done any studies of the keys used for meat cans?
Not to my knowledge, they have not done any typology studies like they have with the pull tab. So as far as I know, they look very similar. The food meat
That's
cans or the coffee cans. But no, I don't think anyone's done any kind of typology study on that.
All
Thank you
right.
very much, Tom, and thank you to everyone for participating today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all